Welcome to the Prophecy Club. You know, we have had some really strange weather lately. Why is that? What is going on with the weather? Would you believe that there is a secret weapon that the Americans tried to perfect, but they couldn't perfect it? I understand that we have a basic math calculation in our understanding of math, and it will not allow us to calculate it out. However, the Russians don't have that problem. And the Russians have perfected this to the nth degree, and it may very well be, it certainly explains a lot of our strange weather. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about scalar wave. It was first invented by Nikola Tesla, and I'm about to have Bill Schnoebelen come on and tell you all about it, so I won't take all of his thunder. But the point is, this scalar wave can go around the globe, and it basically leaves one spot and then appears in another spot. It can make large amounts of the atmosphere very hot or very cold. Well, so what does that do? Well, you make something very hot, the very large amount of the atmosphere, and what do you cause? A tornado or a hurricane. Or you make it very cold and you bring in massive amounts of snow and ice and things like that. So that can really cause havoc in an economy and in a nation. And it is, let's put it this way, I'm not the only one that believes that the Russians have probably been using this on us and other nations for a long time. Then there's the other explanation about the birds. You remember, here a couple of years ago, there was reports of birds just falling, entire flocks, just falling out of the air, dead. They were dead by the time they hit the ground, okay? What is that? That can't be some disease. You can't get a whole flock of birds to die in mid-flight. And then, of course, we also had millions of fish washing up upon the shores of lakes and some streams. What is all that? Well, let me just explain. All of that can be caused by scalar wave. Scalar wave can destroy anything in the air, on the ground, on the sea, under the sea, any place on the globe, anytime they want, and here's the kicker, there's very little residue to let you know that this is what has done it. Matter of fact, there are a lot of people that believe that's what took out the Challenger, okay, scalar wave. But this information is really powerful and really important, so much so that instead of asking $30 for this DVD, you can get it today for only $15 by calling your Prophecy Club, 785-266-1112. More on that later. Now, Bill Schnoebelen in Russia's secret weapon to defeat America.
The FBI came in, our wonderful FBI, and they said that the government was vitally interested in preserving Tesla's papers. Yeah, real good. Now that the guy's dead, they wouldn't pay attention to him when he was alive. 2 days after Tesla's death, representatives of the Office of Alien Property went to his room at the New Yorker Hotel and seized all of his possessions. See, Tesla never became a U.S. citizen, so he was considered a resident alien. Most of his remaining papers eventually made their way to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, where a museum was created in Tesla's honor. And because at that time they had the communist Tito regime there, all access from Western scientists, Western analysts was shut off. But of course the Soviets could look at anything they wanted. And that brings us up to date, or more or less. Now we're in our modern era, and as early as 1960, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev referred to his nation's forthcoming scalar weapons. He addressed the Presidium, and he said this: "We have a new weapon, just within the portfolio of our scientists, so to speak, so powerful that if unrestrainedly used, it could wipe out all life on Earth." And now, in retrospect, we think that was probably a reference to the early beginnings of scalar weapons. Didn't take them long. The tip of the EM iceberg was that they used electromagnetic weapons against the U.S. Embassy. They bombarded the U.S. Embassy with microwave beams. And as a result, 2 U.S. ambassadors died of cancer. And many other people in the embassy were rendered ill and got lesser forms of cancer. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The Russian military was not shy about using these unconventional weapons. And all of them were a whole order of magnitude under the scalar weapons that we're talking about this evening. Now, realize, most of you know the Manhattan Project was this enormous effort that the U.S. government put into toward the end of World War II to develop the atomic bomb and beat Hitler to the punch. Well, when the Russians went to work on scalar technology, they invested the equivalent of 7 Manhattan projects. So imagine how much progress they made. The first time we have any evidence that the Russians used scalar weapons militarily was in the incident of the USS Thresher. That was one of our nuclear submarines, and it went down very mysteriously on April 10th, 1963. It was never found. The reason why we think this probably was scalar is because, mysteriously enough, one day later, near Puerto Rico, there was a mysterious underwater explosion. Now, the authorities checked with the seismologist, they checked with the geologist. There was no earthquakes, there were no underwater volcanoes, there was no explanation for this odd explosion. Soon after that, we began experiencing various downed aircraft. And then finally, in April, May of 1985, now this is 20 years ago, they brought their entire power grid online. They had their entire scalar weapons defense system up and running 20 years ago. That's when things really started happening. In November, for the first time, they started tinkering with one of our space shuttles. In December of that year, they took down an Arrow DC-8, which was a military aircraft. In September of 97, they took down several Titan 34D missiles. Now, these were several things. They were testing the ABM mode of scalar weapons. In other words, the ability to be an anti-ballistic missile weapon, to take out missiles. But they were also doing another thing. They were kind of pinging or tweaking our intelligence services, our military, to see if the military would go, gee, that looks like scalar weapons to us. But they didn't. And there's no evidence that the military had any clue of what was going on back in this time frame. Then there's the whole issue of weather. This has already been mentioned by Stan and also by Tesla. The idea that you can use scalar waves to control weather. You'll notice that particular Doppler weather slide there. You see that kind of odd thing down at the bottom off the coast of South Carolina. Well, those odd finger-like things, according to people I've talked to that are in the retired U.S. Air Force radar people, that is a sign of scalar activity. They created the deep freeze of 1967, which was really pretty awful, and they began full-bore weather warfare on our country on July 4th, 1976, our bicentennial, and it has not abated since then. Now here you'll see, these are just examples. This is a map of the United States, Doppler radar map. You'll notice that thing that's over Wyoming. That's very obviously not a natural cloud phenomenon. It's a perfect sphere. That is probably a Tesla globe. I have a friend who's an Air Force radar tech, and he tells me that when you see something like that and it's mostly hollow, it's almost certainly a scalar dome, a Tesla dome. Now look at this, by way of contrast. Here is a similar thing over Puget Sound, but notice how that's almost entirely solid. What that is a sign of radar jamming. If you see a totally solid thing like that, that's radar being jammed. And it was probably being done by our own military, because there's a lot of military bases up in Puget Sound area. This is an example of a very unusual cloud formation hovering over eastern California. Notice how it looks perfectly straight. In fact, it has a perfect hexagonal angle there pointing out up around northern California. Look at that. That's not natural. And what you need to understand is that with these scalar devices, they can steer clouds around the way you can steer your family car, moving entire cloud masses. Now, this is exceptionally interesting because this particular slide, there should be a thing coming up of a burst over Alberta, and of a similar kind of Tesla globe. And what you're seeing there is actually the detonation of a Tesla globe that's bigger than the province of Alberta. And what I want you to understand is that in the process of compiling all of this, there are also slides that show a very similar kind of globe materializing over Littleton, Colorado, the day of the Columbine shooting, and another globe materializing over Jonesboro when that particular place was experiencing the high school shooting. In addition to causing freakish tornadoes, the like of which have seldom been seen, the Russians also have been tampering with our oceans. Really serious weather problems can be caused by heating and cooling the oceans to create El Nino effects and other similar weather engines. So in other words, they can create an artificial El Nino. And these, we know the problems. We've all heard it on the news. You have droughts, you have forest fires, you have deaths due to heat waves, flooding, and other fringe benefits. By fringe benefits, I mean all of this stuff increases the people's reason to think, oh, maybe global warming is real. Oh, gee, maybe we ought to sign the Kyoto Treaty. Maybe all of the tree huggers are really right, you know. When actually, it probably is more likely the Russians fooling around with our weather. Now, I mentioned something earlier about the school shootings at Columbine and elsewhere. It's important to realize that if you are a student, as I was, of psychology, I used to be a licensed master social worker, you know that if a person has a mental disorder, if they're depressed, if they're, behavior disordered or whatever the case might be, and all of a sudden there's a very sudden drop or rise in barometric pressure, you know what that does? That pushes the person over the edge. It can very easily make them snap. And so what the Russians, I believe, have been doing is they have been dropping these globes over these cities, and they're assuming that somebody there in that city is going to be, a few fries short of a Happy Meal, and they're going to go out and they're going to do something violent. Now, I'm not saying this is the only reason for like post office shootings, school shootings, etc. There's many reasons for them. I believe part of it is the fact that we have all this violence in our media, violent video games, lack of good parenting, and also, of course, the fact that most of the kids that are involved in these shootings, and most of the adults, for that matter, are on powerful psychotropic drugs like Prozac. And that's kind of the worst-kept secret about all of this. So all this stuff is used to advance the control of the gun control lobby, the drug lords, and I don't mean the ones in Colombia, folks. I mean Eli Lilly, I mean Pfizer, I mean Merck, and of course the psychiatric lobby. And then, of course, there's also our wonderful president and his program to have no child left undrugged. Then, of course, there's the earthquake threat. We've already heard from Defense Secretary Cohen that electromagnetic induction of earthquakes is now recognized. And on the left side of your screen, you see there a graphic from a magazine from like many years ago showing Tesla sitting there and the earth blowing apart in two like an apple being split in two. You know, that statement I used back at the beginning of the meeting. Something definitely is going on in the earthquake department. Seismologists have noted that the frequency of earthquakes is going up faster and faster and faster. When I was out in California, someone told me they had 5 earthquakes out there just in the last couple of days. In the early 1900s, the normal rate of large earthquakes was 2 or 3 a year. Well, to this time, like for example in 2000, in 1 week, they had 20 major earthquakes. We all know about the tsunami that happened earlier, and this kind of stuff is going to happen more and more, partly I think because people are tampering with this. You can create an earthquake with scalar energy. You just have to be patient. You just gradually send scalar beams into somewhere where you know that there is in fact a fault line. The energy builds up, the tectonic plates gradually slip, and then all of a sudden there's this catastrophic slip, and you have a huge destructive earthquake. And let's say you live in a part of the country where there aren't many earthquakes. There's no fault lines. Well, that doesn't matter. You can use scalar technology even to create a flat plate earthquake. So you can't run, you can't hide, folks. Probably the most obvious example of using scalar energy in this fashion was the Yugoslav earthquake of 4/15/79. Now, why we think this was scalar is the earthquake was immediately followed by a cold explosion. And that's going to be very significant, as we'll see in a few minutes. This had a magnitude of 7.2 on the Richter scale, which is a pretty powerful earthquake. It had an epicenter of 33 kilometers deep and more than 100 aftershocks. The other significant thing is that it happened in April. And somebody asked, well, what's important about April? I says, well, it's income tax day. But that's not really the reason. The reason is that in the old days of the Soviet Empire, they would have a huge meeting of the Supreme Soviet in very early May every year. It was like their big holiday. And so they'd usually, if they were going to do something big, they do it right in April, because that way they could have something to kind of brag and beat their chests about at their big meeting. Then, of course, there's scalar waves and supervolcanoes. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about the fact that we have our very own supervolcano in Yellowstone. And essentially what you're seeing there on the screen is Yellowstone Falls, and a beautiful place, and that's part of what's called the Yellowstone caldera in geology. And there's been many things on the media, Discovery Channel, whatever, about how there's this enormous magma dome underneath Yellowstone, which supposedly is overdue right now for an eruption. And if it is, it would be like 5 or 10 times worse than Mount St. Helens, minimum. And I had a fellow come up to me at one of the meetings who is a Christian, who's a geologist, and he said, what I'm about to share with you is absolutely true. The geologists know about this, that's why it's going out in the media. The problem is that this caldera in Yellowstone has been targeted already, we are told, by scalar weapons. So they've got it in their crosshairs, so to speak. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is, if you're familiar with a supervolcano, if this thing erupts, first of all, it's going to probably take out most of Wyoming, just in the first few seconds. Probably part of Utah, part of Idaho, part of Montana. The next thing that's going to happen is, because again, we're talking about maybe 6, 7 volcanoes erupting virtually very much close to each other in time. There's going to be huge amounts, tons and tons of ash being sent up into the atmosphere. And because the prevailing winds tend to blow from west to east, it's going to go out over the Great Plains states. And essentially, if you're in the Great Plains states like Nebraska or, even Iowa, you're going to get like 5 to 10 feet of ash dumped on you. And I tell you, I had a colleague in the ministry, Ed Decker, who lived out in Seattle when Mount St. Helens erupted. And he was driving over the Lake Washington Bridge. And he said that stuff was coming down. It was like the worst blizzard you'd ever seen. You couldn't hardly see anything. Cars were skidding around on the bridge. Cars were stalling because this ash gets in the air filter of your car. And it was a mess. And see, that was just one measly volcano. This thing is going to be probably 5 to 10 times worse than that. So you might as well figure that the whole Midwest is going to be wiped out. And that even as far east as Indiana, they're going to still have, a lot of ash and stuff, killing millions and millions of people, millions and millions of livestock, basically wipe out our breadbasket, the whole Midwestern America. And of course, if you remember when Mount St. Helens erupted, it darkened the sky for many days in parts of the country. And it was literally like the book of Revelations, where you could not see the sun. The sun was darkened and the moon looked red at night because this stuff was up in the sky and it was actually changing the spectrograph of the atmosphere. So, this is one thing you've really got to pray about, folks, because whether or not the scalar waves hit it, supposedly this thing can go off at any time. Then we have the Challenger disaster. This is probably the most spectacular use of scalar weapons against a U.S. target to date. January 28, 1986. We all can remember it. That was the first time a space shuttle blew up. It was one of those catastrophic moments that seared in our memory. And there's every reason to believe that it was part, indeed, of a scalar attack. Why do we think that? Well, basically, there's 3 reasons. First of all, the use of what are called wet runs. Now, what's a wet run? Well, you all know the word dry run. It's when you have a dress rehearsal of something. Well, a wet run, in the case of the military, is when you actually fire the weapon to get the range right, okay? Now, what you need to realize is that the shuttle is kept away from the launch pad until it's approximately ready to be hooked up and launched. They keep it in what's called the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is, I think, the largest building on Earth. And then right before the launch, the day before, they trundle out on this giant railroad car. So that means the day before the launch, there's nothing on the launch pad. And what's interesting is that witnesses reported that they were just wandering around, and they happened to notice that there were these flashes of light around the launch pad. There were cracks and boom-like sounds, or just like a second of an appearance of a white globe of energy. just that quickly, and then it was gone. And, people saw it, well, what the heck, they thought just something out of the corner of their eye, maybe they had a speck in their eye or whatever, and they didn't think anything of it. But then later on, now that we know about what scalar weapons function like, it's very obvious they were trying to get their range right. The other thing is the use of weather technology. We've already talked about how you can use these weapons to change the weather. Well, what happened is that was a record cold week in Florida. And even the conventional scientific community acknowledges that extreme cold had an impact on the shuttle's structural integrity. But there's another factor. You can also use scalar waves to soften metal. And they believe that was also done. So it was like a 1-2 punch. And then the third punch is, of course, when the thing finally lifted off, they sent one of these globes at it, and they materialized it just I was talking about at the beginning of the program, and blew the thing to kingdom come. And we all know what happened. All hands on board were killed. Now this stuff is so powerful, it even has residual after effects. And that's because in order to make this work, you have to have a grid laid down. And there is a grid that's somewhat bizarre in its function. It's called the woodpecker grid. That's been laid over North America since 1976, and it's an energy grid. The Defense Department knows all about it. They can't do a darn thing about it. And when you fire a scalar weapon on this energy grid that's over North America, it causes resonance around the grid nearby. And that's called high-frequency localization signals. And what happened is that animals, those very small brains like birds, are affected by this scalar energy on this grid, and you'll notice there's no birds flying the day of the scalar of the shuttle launch. Also, a few days after that, in the early part of February, nearby, I think it was in Alabama, a little bit away from the shuttle launch area, but it was still, again, resonating on the grid, there was this whole county where all the birds just suddenly dropped dead for no apparent reason. And the Department of Agriculture in the state had no idea why it happened. But it was like every bird and a lot of little rodents and things like that were found dead. No explanation, no viruses, no nothing. So that is, again, a sign that scalar weapons were fired. Now the question then becomes, why are the Soviets way ahead? Why did this happen? Well, part of it is the Soviets paid attention to Tesla, and we basically just ignored him. Also, the Soviets poured billions of dollars and billions of man-hours of research into this. We didn't. And there's a certain level of cultural arrogance on our part. Remember this quote from the beginning? Everything that can be invented has been invented. That's how a lot of scientists think. And as I've said, they just have their minds closed to this sort of reality. Our big mistakes, number one, were assuming the Russians were ignorant peasants. We used to make jokes about that, they're so dumb they make a phonograph record and it goes the wrong way around, or they make a refrigerator over in Russia and you can use it to cook your dinner in. Well, maybe that's true. But you see, the problem over in Russia is that at that time it was a socialist state, and basically they could get away with making crummy stuff because that's all you had. There was no competition. And instead of spending their money making better Barbie dolls or better microwave ovens, they were spending their money developing scalar weapons. So that's why we had this idea that they were all ignorant peasants. Also, you as scientists arrogantly assume that we knew all the laws of physics, and we don't. It's a big universe out there, folks, and we don't even begin to understand it, and yet we think we do. We are also over-reliant on our huge nuclear arsenal. I mean, we have all of these nuclear weapons. We have the triad base, where you have one leg of the triad is our land-based missiles, one leg of the triad is our bomber wings, B-52 bombers, B-1 bombers in the air, 24 hours a day. And then, of course, we have the best part is our nuclear submarines, which can't be detected, so we think, and they're cruising around in international waters with payloads of dozens of nuclear warheads. And we're so confident in that. We put all of our eggs, so to speak, in the nuclear basket. What if someone came along with a weapon that could totally nullify that arsenal? Because I'll tell you right now, if our information is correct, all you would have to do, if you were in Russia, is flick a button, aim a certain thing a certain way, and you could wipe out every missile in America, make them all duds. in the contiguous 48 states in about 5 seconds. And then where would we be? In our pride, in our technology, we forgot about Sputnik. Remember Sputnik, those of you that are old enough? I'll tell you, I can remember it. I mean, it was the first satellite in orbit, and we didn't do it. The Russians did it. And it was scary. I can remember, in fact, seeing these big, huge headlines, and I went to Catholic school, and nuns were all scared and everything because they kept thinking that, the communists were going to come over and take over America and rape the nuns. And we heard about that almost every day, and especially after this Sputnik thing happened. They were having us pray every day to protect America from the Russians coming over and invading and raping the nuns. And I had nightmares about this. It was so scary. And I didn't even know what rape was. I was only 8 years old. But it sounded scary, And they were thinking that the Soviets could rain down nuclear fire on us from space. And then the other thing we forgot, who put the first man in orbit? The Russians, Yuri Gagarin. We forgot that the Soviets almost won the space race, So, again, we were just so cocky and so self-confident we let this slip by, I'm afraid. So, back in the 60s, Robert McNamara was always worried about the missile gap. Who has the most nuclear missiles, Well, now we have a scalar electromagnetic or electrogravitation gap. See, a lot of you people, I'm sure, know about the HAARP, the High Altitude Auroral Research Project. That's something America has, or at least it did. I hear varying reports that it's either was dismantled or it was moved or whatever. But the point is, that was a very high level of technology that we possessed. But unfortunately, it was only first generation. The Russians are working on third or now even fourth generation iterations of this technology. So, we're really playing catch up, folks. Now, what are the types of scalar weapons? Well, first of all, there's exothermic mode, then there's endothermic mode, and there's the mind snapper mode. Now, there's some big words there. Exothermic is just a fancy physics term for something that gives off heat. If you strike a match, that's exothermic. On the other hand, endothermic means any process that absorbs heat. And that mind snapper name is pretty evocative. I don't think we need to define that. We'll talk more about each of these.
I'm going to interrupt the broadcast right there because I want to give you the opportunity to get this DVD. It is awesome. It's called Russia's Secret Weapon to Defeat America by Bill Schnoebelen. Normally a gift of $30, but if you call today, you can get it for a gift of just $15. Call 785-266-1112. I don't think it's on the website for that price. You'll probably have to call 785-266-1112. Russia's Secret Weapon to Defeat America. Gift of $15 or more. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your prayers, and thank you for your gifts of support. Now from the Prophecy Club, some exciting opportunities for you. I've heard the testimonies of over 35 different people that have died and gone to heaven. But I think Dean Braxton's testimony is the best, simply because he spent the most time there. He spent 1 hour and 45 minutes in heaven. He tells you what Jesus and the Father and the throne looks like, and our new Jerusalem and our mansions, whether it's a pyramid or it's a square. Everything is based on love and is alive. How we communicate, whether we talk or just by thoughts, how we move, do we walk or do we fly, our relationships with our families and others, and our glorified bodies and garments and what they look like. Normally valued at $30, but you can call a Prophecy Club and get it right now for just a gift of $15 or more. That's 785-266-1112. I spent 45 minutes in heaven by Dean Braxton. 785-266-1112 or prophecyclub.com. We know that a disaster in rioting in our streets is coming, and the number one cause of death after a disaster is contaminated water, because the average person can't go more than 3 days without clean water. You can run contaminated water through a Berkey and drink it immediately, which is why the missionaries choose Berkey. I recommend a Royal Berkey with 4 filters for a gift of $406 plus shipping. Call 785-266-1112 or go to prophecyclub.com and see our entire line of Berkey filters.